Okay, Francesca. I wanted to leave you alone after the whole political correctness is not hurting free speech thing because I thought we left on somewhat of a high note, but I'll get to you in a minute. One thing I've always wondered about people who complain about low-hanging fruit is where they actually think the high-hanging fruit is. And yes, I'm getting on your case right now. The very definition of high-hanging fruit is probably something along the lines of an argument that is difficult to debunk. If an argument is difficult to debunk, then would that not cause some internal reflection about how you might be wrong, and you're actually requesting I debunk a correct person? Perhaps an argument is difficult to debunk because it's correct. What determines what is or isn't fruit liable for the picking and what is just correct information? Is it the label on the packaging? It simply must be. And by the way, if someone's initial claim or eventual conclusion is indeed false when compared to reality, there is no range of fancy words, rhetoric, meta-analyses of a bunch of flawed studies, or misleading that can possibly make that person factually correct. Again, what's the distinction between what is fruit and what is correct? If you can't debunk something yourself, why do you not question yourself? Why do you send something to someone else to respond to? Is it perhaps because you simply assume that something is wrong and need someone else to tell you why it's wrong? Is debunking bad and common arguments that people happen to sometimes believe not a worthwhile endeavor unless I debunk the reasonable people? Well, those people are by definition reasonable and probably don't believe in all of the crazy that presents itself. And if they do believe in that crazy, well, congratulations, they have now ventured to the lower levels of the tree, haven't they? Anyway, MTV, hit me with your best shot.
Have you ever wondered why people say, oh, I don't see color as a way to fix racism? Yeah, that doesn't work.
Sorry, Martin Luther King Jr. You were clearly incorrect, even though you headed one of the biggest civil rights successes in the history of the United States. Remember when he said something like, I have a dream that my 4 little children will one day live in a nation where they will totally be judged by the color of their skin because that is the only way to totally break down the systemic problems that people of color face. The only way to promote intersectionality among our culture is to have all of my problems solved for me by people who do judge me based on the color of my skin. Character doesn't matter. Ah, some good old-fashioned benevolent racism. The difference between Martin Luther King Jr. and yourself, Francesca, is that Martin Luther King Jr. actually desired to be equal. He didn't desire superiority, he didn't desire any form of special treatment, he simply desired to be legally treated just like a white person would be legally treated. You're trying to undo all of that work that was done, making race an irrelevant factor determining how to treat someone, and that makes you my enemy. Unless you're speaking in a biological sense, like black or white people are more likely to develop certain diseases, race should not be an issue. Merit and character should be what defines you, not the race you happen to belong to. And if your race is one of the most important parts of your identity, I propose that you've made a grave error of judgment. Either that, or you've admitted that you aren't a very interesting person to begin with. What's interesting to me is that a lot of people who say these things actually mock references of Martin Luther King Jr. like it's some sort of ignorant point, but it isn't. In the 1960s, I would be marching through the streets, arms locked with this reverend, and you would be holding up a sign that said, race traitor, segregation forever. We are one sentence in, ladies and gentlemen. Strap in.
On this show, we talk about race all the time, but I've got a bomb to drop. Biologically speaking, race doesn't exist.
Actually, yes, it does, considering what we define race as today is strictly within biological constraints. This is actually pretty similar to someone saying that biological sex is a social construct simply because people arbitrarily put males and females into 2 separate groups. No, there are observable biological differences between them, mainly their sex organs, and there are biological differences between different races. For example, skin color. Race is not biologically deterministic, nor is it something that doesn't exist biologically. I don't understand this point. You don't have to pretend like a fact isn't real to make something irrelevant when judging an individual person or group of people. Plus, if race doesn't exist, how do we determine who is which race? How do we notice color if you've made it an irrelevant factor in determining race? You get on the case of those who try to make race irrelevant, and then when people make it relevant, you scream, piss, and moan that race doesn't exist. You're internally inconsistent, and it shows. Big time. Race isn't important to me when judging someone. Oh my god, you're purposefully ignoring our problems. Okay, now I do judge people by their race. My race is the best. Racist! Can we just stop with this disgusting, perpetual, race-slathered badminton match and leave race out of the equation? It doesn't matter. Oh, and P.S. It seems like the only way to win here is to actually judge people by their race, but judge certain races as wholly better or more deserving than others. Whichever races she deems are worthy, though.
Oh my goodness, we've all been lied to! Wait, why am I hosting this show?
Do not leave me that opening. Do not leave me that easy of an opening.
So race isn't biological, but the social construct of race and racism still have a very real impact on everyone's lives. And this isn't just about feelings.
Whenever someone says, and this isn't just about feelings, you can probably rightfully assume that it will be just about feelings.
Race is all about the structural foundation of social power.
What? What? Is your race determined by how much social power you have? Do I become a different race if I gain more social power? Or is my social power determined by my race? Don't try to wriggle your way out of this one. This is an absolute gem. It's like sifting through a gigantic pile of coal and finding a diamond that glistens excitedly in its newfound sunlight. But then demands we revert to Jim Crow laws, and so I decide that maybe leaving it in the ground was a better idea.
So why do so many people incorrectly think race is biological? Well, beyond the fact that we like to group people based on external characteristics, it goes like this. In biology, there is a concept of genetically different subspecies, which a lot of people confuse with human races. Biologists actually have a scale for this, and humans don't even come close to qualifying. Throughout history, people have used this incorrect understanding of subspecies to justify all kinds of terribleness, and even proclaim other races as less than human. But modern genetics has shown that the lines around race are so arbitrary that they're actually meaningless. And since I'm not a scientist, I'll take a quote. Francis Collins, the director of the National Human Genome Research Institute, said it himself: "Those who wish to draw precise racial boundaries around certain groups will not be able to use science as a legitimate justification." Oops, I dropped the mic.
That was really sad, actually. You generally don't drop the mic like a minute and a half into the video. Then you have to slog through the rest of the video after awkwardly picking up the microphone that's probably a little damaged now that you were so irresponsible with it. But, let's continue.
So if race doesn't exist biologically, why do we keep talking about it? Sound the alarm! We keep talking about race because we created it! Yay, us!
But that doesn't mean that we don't draw those lines based on biological distinctions. Yes, humans created quote-unquote race by inventing a term for this biological phenomenon, regardless of how outwardly meaningless, and making groups based on that. But that doesn't mean it isn't biological in nature. That's the thing. It's just something we use to signify some sort of difference we see. With this standard, anything can be a social construct, because humans created the terms and classifications. Planets are a social construct. It's like people can't see the nuance within this whole race thing very well. Race is not everything, and race is not fundamentally non-existent biologically. Race exists, it's just irrelevant when talking about nearly everything. Who cares?
That's right. Race is a social construct. A social construct is a category, perception, or idea created and developed by society and then applied to individuals or groups.
Developed by society. Just because society puts certain people in certain groups due to certain biological features, it does not therefore follow that the biological features used in selecting those groups was created via socialization. Look, I'm not any sort of race realist, biologist, or any of that mumbo-jumbo, but I am someone who can determine that these things are indeed biologically determined, regardless of how arbitrary that grouping may be. So, your plan throughout this whole video is to say that racism isn't solved by being colorblind, as in, race is not a relevant factor when I judge someone, and your very next point of attack is, biologists say that race is basically meaningless. Are you or are you not advocating that people be colorblind so you can scold them for it at this very moment? You know that when people say colorblind, they don't mean I literally cannot determine to any of my own satisfaction what your race happens to be, right? They don't.
But social constructs are still very real and have huge impacts on our lives. Because you know what else is a social construct? Money.
Because you know what else is a social construct? Money.
Do you consider money an individual or group? I mean, yes, money is a social construct, but it contradicts your previous definition about what a social construct is. It's like it's physically impossible for you to remain internally consistent here, Ramsey. Just be honest, instead of spouting off what other people have told you to say without doing any checking of opposing opinions. It helps.
And if you don't think money has an enormous impact on your life, well then congratulations. You either have a trust fund or you're an adorable baby. Or maybe you're a dog. Here's what I know. Talking about racism just creates more racism.
You have that fundamentally flawed with your little adorable mocking voice there. No, really, you should do that some more. Love it. The adage goes, talking about race just creates more racism. The more and more you convince people to consider their race an important part of who they are is the moment you create the bedrock for racism. As I've said previously, if I ask someone, tell me about yourself, and they say, well, I'm a male, I'm black, these are all my medical records, tell me about yourself, I'm walking away immediately. Mainly because they've proven themselves to not be worth my time and interest, considering they thought that was the most interesting thing about them. But if someone says, well, I enjoy baseball, I play the piano, I'm really trying to get into woodworking, but I really don't have the money for the tools yet, I absolutely hate romantic comedies, and honestly, not a huge fan of any of the political candidates. Then I'd talk to that person for a long time, because they define themselves by their actions, ideas, and interests, not by what they were just born as one day. People who harp on race are boring, and isn't that the biggest sin of them all?
No. First off, race isn't the problem. Racism is. And even if it was the problem, problems don't get worse when you talk about them, and they don't magically go away when you ignore them. Not true. I had 5 cavities, I ignored them, and all 5 of those teeth fell out. Poof. Problem solved.
Oh, that was cute. See, what inevitably happens when you try to solve whatever you deem to be racism, I'm sure it's going to be incredibly egregious, but we'll get there, is that not every single person of a certain race faces those problems. Also, people not within a specific race you're mentioning don't just avoid facing that particular problem due to their race. So, if you draw your solutions down racial lines, you're ignoring some of the victims because of their race, and helping people who do not need to be helped based on their race. But as we've seen, race is not biological in any sense. Race equals social power. So we have to ignore one of 2 realities to maintain this proposition, don't we? Either people become different races at different heights of social power, or your race is what determines your social power. Since these are universal claims, I only need one example to remove this claim from the debate. I have less social power than Denzel Washington. I also have less social power than your average black middle management employee. Oh no! We've all been lied to! Wait, why do I host this channel?
Colorblindness, while nice in theory, has no effect on structural and institutional racism.
Give me an example of structural racism that actually exists that can't be solved by implementing policies that don't give credence to race. Listen to yourself, Ramsey. You're saying the solution to structural racism is to implement policies that are racist in nature. The only way to stop this flood is to pump more water into the area, even though there was no flood, but now I get to complain about my shoes being wet. Checkmate, racists.
Racism is a system, and that system benefits certain people at the expense of others.
Which people? Now is not the time to be coy. Be honest with what you believe. Be direct.
Ignoring it just lets those problems persist.
Which problems? I can't help you if you don't point me to the obvious, clearly, totally exists structural racism. Saying structural and institutional and unconscious is not a get-out-of-jail-free card. If you're going to make this claim, be specific, or I'm inclined to disbelieve you.
Don't believe me?
No.
Let's take a look at some examples where colorblindness doesn't work. Number 1, preschool punishment. Let's face a fact, preschool-aged children of every race are monsters. But according to the US Department of Education Office for Civil Rights report released in 2014, Black children make up 18% of preschoolers, but almost half of all suspensions. Half!
Yeah, I read that data collection report that you mentioned, and I saw nothing about more punishment for the same behavior type stuff in it. It was raw data, and here's the graph from it. There you go. There's the raw data. Anyone who takes this and concludes racism is a moron who enjoys jumping the gun. We don't know why these individual kids were suspended. We don't know what the circumstances in each case were or anything to that effect. It gives us numbers, but it doesn't give us an answer to the why question, as in, why are these numbers the ones we're seeing? I recall you saying almost half and then showed 50% on screen. Maybe I'm being a stickler, but among the different types of disciplinary actions a school could take, 32 to 42% isn't exactly almost half. You also simply cited the Atlantic in your description as opposed to the actual raw data, but my clicker finger was itchy, so I went and examined it, and you're wrong. That's not an example of structural racism. That is an example of a disparity. You don't seem to be able to distinguish between the two.
And I don't think anybody believes all these preschool teachers are racist out to get little Black children.
This is an example of structural racism, but nobody thinks there's actual racism going on here. Well, screw me sideways, this is an interesting turn. Is that not what you're suggesting is going on here?
But the data shows that Black and Latino children often face steeper punishments than their white classmates for the same behavior. That's a problem.
What data? Which of the data show this? Here's the specific graph for preschoolers, by the way. I'm sorry I omitted it earlier, but it is true that 48% of Black preschoolers suffer from multiple out-of-school suspensions, so I guess you can get away with the almost half point if you stick to preschool, forgive me. But my previous point still stands about not knowing the specific instances of these suspensions. I simply don't know enough to declare this racism or simply preschools doing their job in disciplining children who don't behave. I need more information.
And simply believing we shouldn't see race or we shouldn't talk about race does nothing to solve this problem.
Asking preschool teachers to judge students on their actions and not by their race will do nothing to curb this perceived problem I've invented, coming to conclusions that the data don't show on their own. If there is racism going on, removing race from the equation would prevent that racism from coming to fruition. Are you suggesting that we should just not discipline Black and Latino students, or discipline them to a lesser degree, even though it is 100% possible that they were disciplined completely in line with whatever every other student would have been disciplined with? You don't know how to argue. I mean, it's a laughable syllogism. Black students get suspended more. We don't think there's any racism going on here. Conclusion, structural racism. Go to bed. Go home.
Number 2, the name study. A study by the National Bureau of Economic Research confirmed that people with ethnic-sounding names, that's a whole nother episode, are less likely to get interviewed when they apply for jobs. Meanwhile, applicants with white-sounding names actually get 33% more callbacks for interviews. It's the equivalent of having 8 years of additional experience. Shout out to all the white Taquans struggling to get job interviews.
I actually have an entire video dedicated to this study in particular, so here's a relevant clip. I'll let me do the talking for me. The study I hear referenced constantly is one where there were resumes sent out to various employers, and the names would vary between the resumes. There would be a white-sounding name like Emily on one resume, and a black-sounding name on the other like Lakeisha, even though not all Black people have names like that. I've known a Daniel, Noah, Paul, Nathan, all Black. Emily could have easily been Black. Now, in the study, it was shown that people with the white-sounding names needed to send 10 resumes on average to receive a callback, as opposed to the black-sounding names, which needed to send around 15. So they used this as evidence of racial discrimination, as opposed to just uncommon name discrimination. The only thing that employers had to go on in this case, to my knowledge, regarding race, was the name, but they want to use this as indicative of racial bias. I'd like to see the exact same study conducted, but with names like Cletus, Bobby Joe, Candy, or Rusty, all of which could be considered white redneck names if we're going off their standard, against names with which people generally have some familiarity in their particular society. So in the case of the US, names like Jonathan, Ryan, Sarah, Paul, Nicole, Kevin, and stuff like that. I haven't done the experiment, but I'm quite positive that you'd get similar results. I don't think it's a matter of the race of the person involved, but the personality of the person with which the name is a general stereotype. Of course, your name has nothing to do with your personality, but with employers, first impressions matter. And if your name is Adolf Hitler Smith, then employers will react to that in a negative way, regardless of your personality. Damn, that dude is smart. You should listen to him.
And it's not just black and white. They've done similar studies around the world, and in Canada, people with white-sounding names were 35% more likely to get callbacks than people with Indian or Chinese-sounding names. So instead of just assuming people shouldn't care about color or names, companies, governments, and schools should take the bias out of hiring and experiment with nameless resumes to, solve the problem.
No, see, they can't do that. Because you said they can't do that, because that would be an example of colorblindness. It would be removing race from the equation, and that can't happen. Well, technically, it would just be removing name from the equation, but whatever. I'd have no problem with nameless resumes, by the way. Make it all about the merit, hell yeah. But you can't just say, this is an example of colorblindness not helping, and then suggest that we make things more colorblind in order to help. I feel like I'm being punked whenever I watch one of these videos when I'm doing these responses. I feel like someone is going to bust through my window and scream, you're on a prank show, these people don't actually exist, look how serious you were, why don't you have a shirt on? But I'm always disappointed.
Number 3, renting an apartment. When the Department of Housing and Urban Development and the Urban Institute did a study about real estate, they found that Black, Latino, and Asian renters were shown up to 12% fewer units than white renters.
Maybe because they happened to pick their f***ing apartment in 12% fewer unit showings. Ideological blinders will certainly keep you on the road most traveled by. I prefer the shortest distance between 2 points method. Mea culpa, bring a compass. And not a compass with your favorite ideas spray painted over the glass portion.
And when the Fair Housing Justice Center used actors to apply for apartments, they found that Black and Latino renters were often told there were no apartments available, while white applicants were shown apartments in the same building. So this building has a pool, a laundry room, and a racist landlady.
Here's a graph from the study you are referencing. Unfortunately for you, since they had a very broad definition about what being favored for your race meant, and they included when not white people were being favored, it shows that there's a whole lot of racism against everyone going on, if we take your premise to be true. Being told about different apartments deal with a whole host of things, or being told about different homes also deal with a whole host of things. This is another indicator that disparity does not necessarily equal racism. This is the problem with people like you who do this. You cite a 190-page study before inspecting it, and then just declare it truth before you actually examine it. Look at all the Black-favored, Hispanic-favored, and Asian-favored percentages. That exists within the study you cited. They actually reported it. Too many people do this as if it's a sufficient argument tactic. Just lob studies that have a conclusion you like in it and declare it fact, while I'm stuck rummaging through it, finding the flaws encased in it. It takes you 30 seconds to say a falsehood, which requires hours of my time to actually prove it to be a falsehood. Or if not a falsehood, not substantiated enough to be declared truth. It's more annoying than when people call straw man even when you've represented them 100% accurately. Stop it. The study's in the description as always.
Colorblindness won't fix housing discrimination. We're going to need smart laws and a concerted effort for that.
Right, because treating people equally while not taking account of their race would in no way solve these problems you perceive. We need smart laws. Ooh, I love smart laws. I wouldn't be against smart laws because then I'd be dumb. What were those again?
So tell me again how colorblindness is going to fix the fact that I can't get an education, a job, or a house.
Wow, what a jump. What an insane logical leap. I mean, that's an Evel Knievel level logical leap. That's like Grand Canyon level logical leapage. That's like crossing the entire Pacific Ocean with a logical leap. Just screw it. You're in a logical orbit at this point.
In many cases, colorblindness is actively harmful because it creates a false sense of security for the groups it directly benefits.
I don't judge you based on your race. Little do they know how schemy we white people are. Soon we will unveil the master plan. Come on, you gotta be kidding me.
The people who've benefited from systemic racism can assume that they got the job or a house or weren't suspended from preschool simply because they were more qualified or just better.
Why have you stopped saying white people and started saying people in privileged positions in one video and the people who benefit from systemic racism? Own your positions. Don't be shy.
Ignoring race, or only acknowledging that it doesn't exist biologically, is not a solution to these systemic issues. It takes work, effort, laws, and new systems to undo racism. These differences may seem minute, but they're part of a very large structure of oppression that's been ingrained in us.
No, it's part of an ideology that has been ingrained in you. Society is not the brainwashed one. Yet. I know you're working on it.
If we can understand that we made it up, we can actively work to change it. Thanks for watching. We'll see you next time right here on Decoded.
It's incredible to me what people are willing to believe in order to hold to their racism equals power plus prejudice argument. They take to defining race as power in and of itself. They think race is defined by power. All I can say to kind of close out is, race is not important. Individual action is. Making people guilty by association simply due to what they happen to be born as is sinister and dangerous to society as a whole. Inspect personalities, not the box the personality happens to be contained in. Have a wonderful day.